This was about 3.5, 4 years ago when Ramp was just around 200 people, and between the two of us, we have experience from it growing to 600. So I'm really excited about the conversation, and Justin has some incredible insights to share. So it's going to be a great conversation. Um, Justin, I would love it actually if you just introduced yourself to everybody. That way, even though you're presenting in the back half of the conversation, it'd be good for folks to know who you are. And if you want to jump in during the conversation, they know who they're talking to.
Yeah, sure. Hey, everybody. Cool to see this first cohort. Thank you, Austin, for letting me on here. Super excited to just chat and talk through stuff. Just a quick intro. I been in this sort of CRM, sales operations, sort of IT space, kind of a blend of business systems and what you call it for the last 13 or 14 years or something. I started in consulting and then eventually went into startups, and then had a pretty good run with some like really cool, fast growing startups. A lot of this has been Series B to D, I would say, where this role and sort of this build buy and like kind of this growth and this role end up being very very valuable. Um, yeah, I currently just consulting right now, having a ton of fun in Perplexity. And yeah, I have happy to share more about what I did at Ramp, what like Austin and I built together at Ramp in the last 2+ years. Um, and yeah, we can let me know. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn and we can continue the conversation elsewhere.
Yeah, he's not giving himself enough credit. I would say, Justin was my partner in crime on revenue technology. We kind of oversaw every systems level tool across the organization with a budget of probably 15 to 20 million between the two of us. I mean, the greater part of our existence at Ramp, it was the two of us effectively trying to scale the machinery that was helping Ramp grow while the machinery was coming off the rails. And a really interesting case study in particular, because Ramp is technically speaking a B2B2C business. It operates like a B2B business, but the machinery behind how we acquire customers and move them through the funnel mapped more to a B2B2C company. And then lots of just problems from scaling too quickly around, we bought too many tools too quickly. They weren't set up by the proper people. We'll talk about the stages of growth over time. And a really common thing is that people have time to grow across the stages. In Ramp's case, by the time it was 2 years old, it was buying $1 million contracts with these different vendors. And so there's some interesting things to unpack there. I won't give it all away. I'm going to jump into the lecture portion of today. I'm going to try to spend 15, 20 minutes here. Good feedback from last time, though, is like I didn't give a lot of pauses. I'm going to pause, and there are some discussion questions that I want to bring up, so I'll try to engage folks a little more. Certainly, though, if you guys have questions along the way, drop them in the chat, and Ben, Chris, hold me accountable if I'm steamrolling through the conversation without enough time to talk. Cool. So with that, we're going to jump right in. We talk about the evolution of the Rev stack. We also talked about the evolution of the MarTech stack because history is really important. I just think this is a general philosophical thing. Like in order to understand why things are the way they are today, you have to understand how they came to be. And so we'll do a little bit of a trip down memory lane. What I would first say is like, there's a really good podcast on Lenny's podcast on Salesforce with Mark Benioff. Strongly recommend it. There's also apologies. There's a couple other pods that Mark Benioff has been just detailing like the beginnings of the CRM space, and it's just really helpful in helping underpin how things came about from from a technology perspective. So CRMs were kind of like born in the 1990s, probably around the same time a lot of people in this room were born. Not everybody, but at least myself. And really they were intended to help transfer what was normally in people's brains into a computer. Like think about sales before the 1990s or 1980s. You literally had a Rolodex, and a Rolodex is just a database. It's a contact database that has people with information. And so when I think then about why this is important, I think a lot about on one hand, um, sorry, I lost my thread there for a second. You know, when I think about why this is important, I think a lot about uh, having an empathy and understanding for why tools are the way they are. And really, I put this slide together because I just feel like in my tour of CRMs in the last year, I've gotten the feedback that you know, particular legacy CRMs are hard to use, or there's problems with their design choices. And you have to think back about why those choices were made long ago. That's kind of like the punchline of what I'm trying to deliver here is just like have an understanding and empathy for why tools are the way they are today. Understanding this evolution will help you identify kind of like where your organization is, especially if it's a large organization. So then I included this baby photo mostly because as a joke, most people don't know that I was an early Salesforce employee. I like to poke fun at the fact that a lot of the tools that we use today are actually older or older than most of us have been in the working world. And really the point is one of the meta themes that I think a lot of us are dealing with is that we have these tools in our ecosystem. They were often installed before we came to be, or the conventional wisdom is that, hey, this is the only way it should be done. And there's this question, I think, on a lot of us, which is like, what should we actually do about it? You know, there's the old adage, which nobody gets fired for using Salesforce, but that didn't come about overnight. It came over a whole generation of people using a tool, and largely speaking, has been successful. But we're starting to see the cracks of these tools, and I'm picking on Salesforce a little bit, but it's not just them. You know, you could pick on Epsilon, you can pick on Marketo, you can pick on even HubSpot to some extent. This is just the natural life cycle of all software, and it's not just Salesforce. It's that, you know, you kind of come to age in a particular environment with tools and technology. Those companies become big, harder to change, and then there's this question of how do you actually thoughtfully plan to scale your organization when some tools are hard to use but enterprise ready, and other tools are not enterprise ready but don't fit into the natural ecosystem. Um, so I think like again, the punchline here is bringing awareness to history, bringing an understanding about where things have been, and challenging the status quo are important tools for the next generation of builders. I mean, more and more, I'm seeing people stand up revenue technology stacks that don't fit the traditional model. They're using tools like Clay. They're connecting things with Zapier and iPaaS. And me and Justin could talk a lot about the problems with that. But I think increasingly we're going to see companies relying on this abstraction of a core way of doing things because it's not unreasonable to consider that there's a new way of being best. So we talked about like the early 90s. I'm going to fast forward now to probably something a little closer. There's a big gap of time in the early 2000s to 2015 where you had DMPs and other cookie-based software. I'm kind of glossing over that. It might be interesting for some of y'all, but I think really from 2000 to 2010 even, we experienced like the evolution of the browser, the evolution of the cookie, the evolution of the DMP. A DMP is effectively tracking people anonymously with a cookie. Mobile comes out circa 2007, 2008 that introduces this whole new concept of what it means to track people and have a browser. And in the background of all this, you still have the CRM being the CRM. You know, you still have a CRM acting as a source of truth. One of the big bets that Mark Benioff built into Salesforce is the idea of an app ecosystem, which said, hey, we're going to defer all responsibility for building connections out to the network, and they then become responsible for maintaining and integrating the ecosystem back to the CRM, which is part of the reason why Salesforce had a lot of power over, you know, I'd say the last 15 years is because it required the masses to come to them to integrate. And it provided a big benefit to users. You could go to one single place to integrate. We'll talk in a second about how integrations have become table stakes and how they're commoditized, but you know, you back up to 2015, integrations are hard to build. They require manual labor. It's a lot of engineering work. And even though this is a marketing technology stack, what it helps expose is that I think around 2015 were some of the prime years where you had really clear examples of stacks that worked for a lot of different businesses. This is like a mobile growth stack, an example from Walmart. The punchline is not that I'm telling you to use Particle. It was just like, hey, you have a CDP and you have a bunch of things connected to it, and this becomes a very traditional model that you can then go rinse and repeat across a lot of organizations. It's the same in revenue technology. I remember one of my first jobs at Branch was integrating our CRM, which was Salesforce, and connecting a bunch of pipelines to it. So there's kind of like a clear model evolving around, well, you go get an outreach tool, you get a tool like a CRM, you connect a bunch of other things to it. And so you have a kind of a central spoke model where you have something in the middle connecting to a lot of apps. And this became the default that we all now experience. It's not uncommon now for us to think about, hey, we have kind of a semi source of truth and then a lot of things connected to it. So then I would say 2017 is when things start to get a little more complicated. One, you just have businesses that are coming up that have both a CDP and a CRM. I didn't really even see that at all in 2015. I don't know if it was because CDPs weren't popular enough or the integration wasn't there, but and Justin, maybe you have an example because you lived the experience at Segment, and Segment arguably was one of the first businesses that was both a CDP and a B2B player. But it was this idea that I'm just letting Shy in. This idea that, now we're starting to track people digitally based on their behaviors, and we're also trying to track their business behaviors. So individual behaviors and business behaviors, and how do we model this data effectively? So I want to pause real quick, Justin. I'd love actually to get your story on like, were you there when Segment started using its own product for itself and trying to integrate that with Salesforce? And like, what were some of the early challenges with that?
Yeah, man, this is at 2016. So yeah, Segment was interesting. I mean, the founding story of Segment is pretty interesting and as well. Like three undergrads built an analytics tool for the classroom that failed, but their open source JavaScript framework was very popular and went viral. And they turned that into essentially an event streaming kind of like CDP narrative to capture event data from websites, from like top of the funnel websites, mobile SDKs, and then pass it through what they call this thing, a CDP, to then action it downstream, mostly for marketing and personas and ads and marketing channels, but then later also for sales, for other go-to-market functions. So the way that they came about realizing this thing was pretty interesting. Um, when I joined Segment, we weren't really using Segment for our go-to-market B2B side. Um, I think the early days we were still trying to figure out like what exactly I mean, other than marketing channels and marketing applications, how to use it for sales. Um,
Mm,
and I would say that for the most part, those things were kept separate, even in my tenure there. Um,
mm,
the one thing that they did branch into was the reverse ETL space. So I think we're pretty early on that. This is before high touch was even created, right? Because the founders are from Segment. And some of the ETLing tooling was really old as well, or really expensive and really difficult. And so we saw ourselves as like if we can pass things down, we should be able to pass things up as well, like this bidirectional sync. Um, but as far as Segment goes, like we use all sorts of marketing tools as well, and we can talk about redundancy where in an ideal state, you have things that are not redundant. But you also have this idea of like perhaps not like a single point of failure. But in realistically, most companies have redundant applications. That's just part of why I think our jobs exist and why we're valuable. But especially at Segment, we had a ton of redundant like marketing capabilities. Part of it because we wanted to try things out and see what worked. Especially, some people want to procure like a smaller vendor, just try them out. And partly because we wanted to stay on top, right? Because marketing applications also in the whole suite of applications change the fastest. year to year. There's the most new ones. The use cases will change, and so being at Segment, which is kind of like maybe where Zapier sits now, you're sort of at an intersection of hundreds of integrations, and you're like, well, I have to like maintain these because I need to know which ones are new, which ones are coming up, so I can support my customers. Um, what was interesting too was that eventually, like when I first joined, a lot of the narrative at Segment was like, we will support all your integrations, like hundreds of them. And we will, there's like first class ones like our CRM or our warehouse, but then there's all sorts of like smaller ones. Eventually, as we got bigger and bigger, we started to realize that supporting all of these was just too difficult. Um, just because we got into like, just to give you like some volume there, we had like 200-300 integrations that we supported, and a small team of engineers. And each of these APIs change seasonally, right? If you're used to Salesforce, there's like seasonal changes. And so 3 to 4 major API changes per vendor a year amounts to basically one large like production level change almost every single day, right? Because you've got like 200 to 300 vendors, 2 to 3 changes a year, couple hundred changes a year. That's almost one a day, 1 to 2 a day. And so it just became too much to support all the way through. So we started to think about, okay, how do we hire vendors or like integrators or connectors to then do the work for us? So just like some history there. But the narrative definitely changed in the 3 years that I was there, all the way up to getting acquired. It was first like, let's just like focus on mobile, and bring in all the different top of the funnel data for marketing use cases. And eventually it was like, let's think about reverse ETL, and then let's think about bringing in more partners to support integrations and yada, yada, yada. So
Yeah, we'll carry on. What's fascinating though, Justin, is one. So I was at mParticle around the same time you were at Segment, and we were in very different roles. I was on growth at mParticle, and I remember asking the question of our leadership team, like, why aren't we using mParticle ourselves? And what's fascinating is I always kind of expected that Segment would have figured it out as well, and it's sounding from you that like this was just before the concept of using product analytics as a touch point or an intent signal for sales was just like not, it wasn't even thought of. I actually think part of the reason why it wasn't thought of is because then you have to like figure out how do you get this event data into the CRM, and there was not a clear way of doing that. People didn't know at the time like, hey, this like just won't work. You literally can't get event data into a tool like Salesforce. I also think it has something to do with the fact that I don't know exactly what the timeline was at Segment, but this idea of like the group identify call. I mean, this is now really common in all CDPs, is that you can call an identify call to identify a user, but you can also call a group identify call, which identifies an organization. And this is getting a little bit into MarTech, but it's related to RevTech in the sense that if you want to connect or marry product analytics data to your CRM, you have to have good marketing tracking on your website. And that group identify call, I don't think existed in 2016. I don't even think it existed until 2019 or 2020. And
yeah,
and I
I
also
don't remember that
remember,
existing at all in the time I was there.
so I mean, that's just like a huge limitation, obviously. The other thing I remember too from Segment's integration with Salesforce is like it was a CRUD based model, and I remember the UI having like you could CRUD on different objects, and it basically the punchline was like the best you could really hope to get out of a Segment connection to CRM was to create leads, and it was not always accurate because I think like it was connected directly to the SOAP API, and there was like no retries and all this other shit. So it's just
Yeah,
again, this is
just to kind of summarize, I think what we ended up figuring out was sort of this roundabout way of doing it, which is like we would try to de-anonymize people that are coming on the website. We would, yeah, we have segmentation, we had kind of personas, we had some basic level of analytics. We would use like Clearbit or like some other stuff. And back in the day, like Clearbit was still pretty hot, I would say in 2016. There wasn't a ton of alternatives either.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, to then find the company, the revenue, like right, it's like Seven cared about, for example, like we use SimilarWeb, like things like website activity, revenue, pretty basic to what most people care about in terms of ICP enrichment, with the exception of maybe like Alexa ranking type stuff. And then we would try to reverse ETL that stuff back into the CRM. Um, in this like very roundabout way of doing things.
Yeah.
Um,
And that reverse ETL, I would say, because we did the same thing at Postmates, is like, it's basically like a manual DAG running. It's like it's not turnkey. It's not just like a click of the button.
Right. In our sense, we built our own, but like that's essentially what it started as, and we're like, wait, there's maybe a market here for the reverse piece as well, because no one's doing that, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Cool. I know we're spending a lot of time on history here, guys, but hopefully this is helpful. So this is kind of like what came next, which is the attempted unification of the CRM and the CDP. This is what we just talked about. Is like, hey, at some point, I think around 2020, people started to realize I actually want a lot of this data inside the CRM, and I want to have the capability there. How do you actually connect these things? And I would argue even today, it's not really possible to connect a CDP elegantly to Salesforce. You can do it to HubSpot, because HubSpot, I guess fortunately for them, they started as more of like an email marketing tool. And so they always had the concept of events. They had to support the ability that, an event occurred in order to fire an email. So I would actually argue HubSpot is one of the only, probably the biggest, only CRM I know that also can act as a CDP. Um, uh, yeah, Jahan, if you have a question too, I'm happy to address it. Do you want to ask now or later?
I just don't want to digress. I think you'll likely end up covering it, so I'll save it for then.
Okay, okay, cool. So we kind of get to the attempted unification, and where this eventually leads is that you have now what everybody likes to call the composable CDP or the composable stack. I really like this term. I think it's great. It fully defines the world we're living in, where there's no longer a best case or single way of doing things. There's just lots of versions of good and bad, depending on your size, stage, and the outcomes you're trying to achieve. One of the classic examples I like to share in MarTech is like pretty much everything is a CDP now. If you can collect event data, you can federate audiences, and you have integrations, you are a CDP, because CDP originally was like a tool that did all these things, but now all tools do these things, or most tools do these things. Even Clarify, for example, we can collect event data. We have SDKs coming out to collect event data. We have lists, which are dynamic, which represent audiences. So technically speaking, we're a CDP. We do all the things that a CDP in 2016 did. Braze is another example. Braze is technically a CDP. They let you collect events, federate audiences, and they have integrations. And this actually gets back to some of what Justin talked about, is like history matters here. It used to be really hard to build integrations. It's not as hard to build integrations anymore. There's better APIs. There are tools like Ampersand that are trying to automate the integration build process. And what's kind of fascinating is with MCP, with the Model Context Protocol, there's a world where agents build integrations on the fly. Not only as a productized service, having agents build integrations, but like you could have an agent building integrations for you custom to your business. And so that's also a question in my mind of where the world proceeds is, do we see the proliferation of tools that manage integrations for people, and you just buy these things, and in the background, they're using AI agents to build, connect, and manage API integrations with one another? Or do you actually just build that in-house? Just say, hey, I'm not going to spend 200 grand to effectively, build a bunch of integrations. I only have 10 integrations I care about. I'm going to hire 3 engineers who are going to use AI to do this for us on our own. That's some of the question I think people are asking themselves. But there is this whole new wave of providers out there that are going to do integrations bespoke, really custom using AI. So that's like maybe something for you all to think about as you plan your stacks for the future. But any long-term bet that relies on a static integration is like not a bet I would take right now. So this kind of leads us to some of the key points of the lecture part before we get into Justin's talk track. There is no silver bullet for designing a stack. I get this question. I even got it on Lenny's podcast. He's like, so what's the golden stack? What's the stack you should build? And I had an answer at the time that was based on the fact that it was 2020, and I gave some examples of tools. But I wish I could go back in time and revise my answer and be like, there is literally no silver bullet. There is no golden stack design anymore. There are only versions of great based on kind of the world you're living in. And I would argue even the best companies have problems. As Justin will talk about with the Ramp example, I was really proud of some of the stuff we did at Ramp, but we still had problems, and we were the most resourced team I'd ever been on in my entire life. So that should hopefully give everybody some conviction that, if you don't see perfect right away, you can go back to your boss and say, well, even Austin and Justin couldn't build perfection. So then, like, what is the perfection you're seeking? And if you embrace this reality, it can be somewhat freeing, because then you're left with just like, okay, well, what are the choices I'm going to make to optimize for the outcome I'm trying to achieve for the company? Because that's what it's all about at the end of the day. Is your company has outcomes, and your job is to help the company get to those outcomes. And so this is kind of the punchline. When we talk about the FRIC model, when we talk about greatness, what really matters is flexibility and the ability to adapt to change, because that's like the only constant in life, and the only constant in business is that things will change. So you could build this really insane, incredible, piece of machinery that does everything you want, but if it's highly inflexible and can't change without a lot of work, effort, time, and money, you're just kicking the can down the road to somebody else. So the framework here has 4 different categories: focus, redundancy, interoperability, and coupling. These 4 categories you can think of as like the equation inputs to the flexibility outcome. I like to sometimes present it as a formula, especially for leaders, like flexibility equals, a function of focus, redundancy, interoperability, and coupling. And I actually evaluate stacks on this framework. You can do it on a scale 1 to 10. You can do it on good, bad, depending on, how, evolved you are. And, just quickly to go through these, focus is all about having tools that solve a problem with high intentionality. Redundancy is just how much overlap tools have without causing waste. And redundancy can be both a good thing and a bad thing, by the way. It's not saying that redundancy is always bad. It's just that sometimes redundancy can be bad. Sometimes it can be a really helpful tool. Interoperability, which is like how well tools communicate with one another. It's not necessarily saying that you have to be using them. I'm not suggesting a particular pattern for operability. It's about like how much overlap is there, because you can almost think of it like like a nervous system. Like, as some nerves are broken or disconnected, do you have the pathways to move data in the ways that you want? That's a really big part of flexibility. And then we get to coupling, which is just, okay, what are the choices you've made in connecting these tools, and how does that result in your ability to operate the stack and make changes? Coupling in particular, I think, was one of the bane of our existences at Ramp. I won't speak too much, Justin, but it's like, I remember in particular, we had coupling between HubSpot and Salesforce, and it resulted in a lot of different problems that were hard to unpack. But the one that sticks in my mind was always that whenever there was a problem, whenever something broke, quote unquote, or was changed or was different, it made it very challenging to move back up the stack and figure out where did that problem originate from, because you have all these streams that are connected to one another. So we'll come back to that a little bit. So let's jump into Ramp. And Justin, I know that you're really eager to tell me all about the problems I created at Ramp with you. So why don't you take it away?
Yeah. For a start, any questions or things from the crowd? Nothing. Okay, perfect. We're doing perfect explanations then.
I
Oh yeah.
have one quick question with regards to identity management and specifically like CDPs. So one of the things I really liked about Segment, we used it at Atlassian. You had, let's say, an anonymous ID and a first anonymous ID, and you're able to build a profile or identity which can eventually be tied to a user. When I think about like CRMs and like the ability to create contacts, there's a lot more free reign on part of like a sales rep to create, in some cases, multiple contacts, maybe associated with the same email. And that manual work or effort makes it sometimes harder to centralize identities. I'm curious to see, like, it's a lot easier to do, I think, in a data warehouse or when Segment is flowing or able to pipe like those anonymous IDs alongside activities that are centralized in that way. But how do you create like a similar level of cohesion as it applies to a CRM platform? I don't know if that's like completely off topic and maybe we save it for the end. But that's my biggest gripe and examples like Pardot might be Pardot prospect ID might be mapped to like 3 Salesforce customer IDs. How do you create a cohesive story in that situation?
You
Justin,
want to,
you want me to answer or you want to answer?
yeah, I can take a step first.
Sure.
Okay, so there's a lot of things here. So the main thing you're asking is like, how do you make sure that things are tied one-to-one between systems, in terms of contacts, isn't like people, users, persons.
Effectively, or how do you create a unified profile of someone within the CRM when it's more prone to, I don't know, manual debt, tech debt?
Totally,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah, and it's not just CDP and CRM. You have to think about the ERP as well. It's actually, the whole journey has that same issue. It's just with different teams, right? Um, ERP side is more account based, but there's like plenty of one-to-one contacts in terms of billing. Um, yeah, I mean, the first thing is like you have to be very clear about what some of your definitions are, for both a company, a customer, right, and your person. And then you have to be able to set rules around it and be able to clarify them and make it visible. Some of those rules should be the same systems across systems. Um, and that's kind of like the baseline, right? Like rules as in like you should just like you should try to not allow duplicate contacts in CRM, especially with the same email, unless there's a use case for different identities, right? Sometimes partnerships is a big one that kind of throws this whole thing. Um, and you can create sort of your validations, your merge, your deduplications, your alignment there and share it and make sure that the CDP also follows it so that when you're doing automated ETLs and data loads, you're also not introducing more duplicate records. So I think that's like one of the major things that I spent a ton of time on, just like thinking through. And there's like two ways of thinking. There's two sides of the coin here. One is prevention, right? Which is like, how do we prevent bad data from coming in? And your one example is like manual, right? How do you ensure? Then it's like, how do you ensure that the user experience is preventing bad data hygiene, right? If you're going to enable users to go into CRM, you should throw errors that are explicit. You should create screen flows that kind of tell them that they're creating a duplicate. And if they're really sure about that, you should give them ability to do merging. So there's the prevention side of this, which is like, if you give them a tool like Clay, you have to make sure that they're not just inserting whatever they want. They're following adherence to best practices. They're looking up the right thing, or at least giving them like swim lanes or guide lanes to like basically not allow them to do what your rules are set out to do. So that's prevention. And then you've got the fixing of it, which is like, cool, all the preventative stuff, great. People are still going to mess it up. That's just the realistic part of it. And so how do you fix it, right? How do you do the actual, so that's where tools like auto merging, auto deduplication, creating those automated rules. And Clay does this well. We use Cloud Dingo. There's plenty of other like pretty cool ones. I started using Validity, demand tools. Austin like built this as part of his CRM, like because his argument is like this should be part of the CRM stack. And it's like, how do you ensure that that stuff is being deduped? The issue with fixing it is that you're also deleting records. As you merge them, the records are gone, which sometimes breaks the one-to-one relationship with other systems. Because if you have HubSpot, you have one person that's tied to like 5 people, and those 4 people suddenly are gone and squashed into the single person, you lose that connection. And how do you make sure that that ends up not breaking essentially? Or if it does break, how do you realign that one-to-one relationship? We had a lot of those issues as well. So I mean, and I don't have a great answer for that, but you have to do it in a thoughtful way where you're like keeping the IDs intact all the way through. And yeah, when you do these migrations, you have to make sure, or these automations of fixing it, you have to make sure that you have good auditability. You have to make sure you have the ability to roll back. This is just some thoughts.
So none of the integrated systems are smart enough to start figuring out when you're merging Salesforce records, those accountant records and so on, as they're folding together. That's just tough luck. That's somewhere out in the
Well, yeah. I mean, I think like Justin brings up a central premise of why we talk about coupling. And that's to say is that you really never know, unless you can dig into the vendor's code, you don't actually know how these integrations work without experiencing the pain yourself and learning firsthand, which is a really big risk to take when you just click a button and go on your merry way. So part of the outcome for flexibility, which we'll get to later, is this idea of like moving data in one direction or one pathway as much as possible. You only find yourself in this position, like Justin was talking about, where effectively a tool is talking back to another tool, which is why, one of the steps we tried to take at Ramp, not to prelude too much, is like, do you have arrows going in multiple directions to having arrows go in one direction as much as possible? There's always going to be cases where you have to break that exception. You have a new capability coming out, a new campaign, you got to connect a tool in a particular way. There's no other way to do it. So you just got to eat the shit and do it. But as much as possible, moving data linearly in one direction means that as you have these things that are happening in a tool, it's not going to impact other systems except the warehouse, which you can actually manage data better in the warehouse. To Jahan's point, like, hey, this is actually pretty easy inside the warehouse. You just have two databases that are connected by an ID and you can manage it, but that takes time and money and energy. And I think like the punchline of all this is like, yeah, there's really not a lot of great ways to do this inside of legacy CRM providers today. Justin comes from the world of, well, you use a CRM with a lot of tools on top to manage it. One of the approaches we take at Clarify, not to make this a sponsored ad, but it's like, I think all these things should just live natively inside the CRM. Like deduplication rules should be automatic inside the CRM. You shouldn't have to buy another $100,000 tool. But I think the other piece to this, which was the original question, is like, hey, how do you marry identity from a CDP, which is more complex, with identity from a CRM, which is less complex? You have to think, at the end of the day, these are all just databases. A CRM is a database where the primary key is email address. A CDP is a more complex database that allows you to merge identities based on a variety of keys. It could be email address, it could be user ID. Now, again, in a warehouse, you can do all this one-to-one. You can say, here's this email address, here's this person. You have this kind of problem in a CRM, though, which is like you're actually tracking people. But when CRMs first developed, they never really had the concept of identity. A person was just an email address. Now people change their emails really often. I have 6 different emails. And so actually identity is really complex now in a CRM. It's a person has a name, has a LinkedIn address, which can also change. LinkedIn, you can change your profile. And if you get married and change your name, that LinkedIn address changes. And then you have 5 or 6 different identities. So actually the model for CRM that would probably work the best is like a probability model where you have like 6 different keys and you're merging people based on the overlap and the likelihood that this person is the same person, right? But like, that's kind of a dangerous thing. There's 2 Justin Tongues in our system. We're pretty sure this new Justin Tongue just switched jobs, Justin Tongue at perplexity.ai. But like, what happens if we merge them incorrectly? And then what's the consequence if all of our tools connected to that get that merge event? So this is the reason why there's no really good answer. But if I had to give one piece of advice, it'd be just like, be careful about what tools you connect, because you can't control all these unknowns, but you can control where the data goes. So if the CRM is the last stop shop before getting to the warehouse, you expose yourself to a lot less liability than if the CRM is up in the stack and there's like 7 tools that are going to get hit by any type of change that you have.
I hear you. So some of the comments you made are what you mentioned. What's your take on basically following people in their career? So what I mean by that is basically having a breadcrumb trail. So to your point, someone's email address changed in the CRM. First they are related to one account and now they change to another, right? I like to see that breadcrumb trail because I have a champion when they move somewhere else. They're a client of ours, employee and a client, and now they move somewhere else. We typically have very happy clients. So now I have someone that will be a champion at their new company. So what's the pros and cons of keeping the same record for Jane Doe as she is changing you're shaking your head. What would you do, Justin? A new record?
This is just my opinion, but it's not necessary. Just like really basic, like you should treat every unique email identifier as a new person. But not a new person, but as a unique record. That's just what I've made most of my rules on. And on the account side, you should treat every unique domain as a new account. And then you can tie them together if you really want to, right? But I don't think I I think what you're asking is, should I keep the same record and just update it? And I would say no. You should just leave it as a legacy thing. Close it. Just leave it there. It can be closed out. It can just be toggled to bad data, whatever, and just create a new one. That's the same person essentially with the new email.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with that. Like if I were operating in today's environment, not building Clarify, that's how I'd operate. The ideal world that I think a lot of us wish for is a world where you actually have a two-tiered object system. You have a person object that lives above the email address, and email address are actually just records. So you can keep your record table clean. Every single email is a different record, but then you have an object up top that says, hey, well, a person object is a collection of emails or a collection of records that have emails or LinkedIn's. And so you can have a person that can be represented in the CRM, but they can have a various collection of emails. And this is kind of important because if you connect your CRM to an email marketing tool, the email marketing tool doesn't give a shit about people. It only cares about email addresses. So this is part of the problem you're dealing with, is that these tools have to speak the language of other connected tools. And in particular, an email marketing tool is like one of the most common connected tools for a CRM. So you inevitably have to end up shaping your data model to fit the outcome that the other provider needs.
And honestly, like the user impact of receiving multiple repetitive emails because you have multiple repetitive, it's fine. Like we've all gotten the same email throughout, throwaway stuff. It's fine. It's not a big deal. I think this matters more in B2C because I do hear there's some people in those industries in the class.
Yeah.
When I was at Airbnb, this is a huge issue because we dealt a lot more with people, not so much businesses. And we had to and we use Salesforce, which was horrible for this. But essentially you'd have to really think about, okay, this person just generally has multiple identities. And I think the only equivalent on the B2B side is maybe partnerships. When you're dealing with partners, resellers, people that are both a partner, a customer, whatever, and they have all these things. The schema of this relationship gets really complicated. But I wouldn't build for partners specifically unless your business is mostly partnerships. Like if you work at HubSpot and 50 to whatever percent of your business comes from partnerships, it makes sense to build your systems that way. For the most part, 80-20, you just want to build for transactional and things that are high volume. I saw another hand up somewhere.
Yeah, that was me. I was going to ask just about federating the behavioral events. So if you do happen to have multiple identities, they're all driving different behavioral events. Like those things feed into your model of how you may approach someone or how you may do your outbound service. So if they are split into multiple identities or multiple contacts, you just may get that wrong. So does that get taken care of by? I mean, obviously it would get taken care of by prevention. Does that generally get taken care of by the merge as well? Have you seen events also merge in when you do have that kind of merge activity?
Well, it depends on, it depends on the outcome you're trying to achieve here, right? Like if you're doing attribution, my advice is if you're not a big enough company, don't worry about it because it's kind of like you're looking for a needle in a haystack. Like you got bigger problems to worry about than going that deep. If you're a big enough company that cares about the nuance here, then you're likely doing this in the warehouse. And if you do it in the warehouse, you're for sure merging all these identities based on some common CDP ID. So, you could have 6 different emails, right? And you may have 3 different user accounts if this person has bought your product in multiple cases. And then you also have name and you have LinkedIn. I'm pretty sure your data analyst is going to try to figure out a way as much as possible to merge duplicate records to just reduce the amount of noise. If it's something different for outbounding or prospecting, you have the opposite of problem, which is actually you don't want to deduplicate these events. You want to make sure every email gets the email. So you run the risk of multiple hitting somebody, but that's far more important than the outcome of them not getting the email. This is what Justin said is nobody's really going to get upset if they get an email twice, because if you signed up and gave your email for a service twice, it's just obeying your opt-in. It's not really, I don't think it's the employer's job to be super smart and try to dedupe your putting your email in twice,
Thank you.
Should we move on? I know we're
move on. Feel free,
Okay.
Justin. Get right rolling.
All right. So yeah, I mean, Austin asked me to do more of a deep dive on one specific example where we worked at Ramp together. I can go over some of the stuff that like when me and him first joined, this is what we thought of. These are some of the like downsides and weaknesses that we saw in the business, so we worked on first. And I'll try to paint some context and brushstrokes here. But yeah, essentially the way that we drew this up was looking at the generate top of the funnel in terms of and splitting it into inbound, outbound, and then going down to how do you close that opportunity, and then how do you do the reporting. So at least in this slide, um, the biggest thing, and Austin mentioned this multiple times, is that, and this is kind of like a final version, but when we started, this was way crazier. We probably had 50, 60 tools at Series C size, which I think is pretty sophisticated and pretty complex for what it was. And a lot of those categorical issues that he mentioned uh, were coupling, interoperability. That's kind of like where this framework was born. Like there was just so many issues that we had to categorize what was exactly happening. And so Austin mentioned this, but I would agree. I would say that the HubSpot Salesforce connection was the biggest issue. And it hit every single category here. It was not focused. It was not flexible. It was not reliable. It was not interoperable, right? Like the coupling was messed up and a lot of this was because we're using the native integration. Another reason is because Ramp sent a ton of emails. Some of it was out of HubSpot for lifecycle. A lot of it was out of Outreach for automated, and salespeople also use Outreach for sales. And we also had SendGrid for transactional, obviously, but we also experimented within SendGrid for product emails. And so, yeah, the volume of emails at Ramp was probably millions a month, which for a B2B SaaS business is insane. For B2C, probably, different volume there. And so a lot of the issues was, if something went wrong, people were deleted. Troubleshooting was impossible. Auditing was impossible. And so a lot of what we did was rip out integrations that like didn't need to exist, were too unfocused, both on the HubSpot and CRM and Salesforce side. We used the native integration only for like minimal, like MVP, exactly what we needed to do. There was a latency issue, right? Like things on HubSpot, things would land on our website, you'd sign up, you go through all this stuff. Like we would enrich you, we would custom score you, we would like push you through all these branches. We would show you a calendar or not show you a calendar. It would land in HubSpot. It would run through workflows. It would land in Salesforce, sometimes up to 30 minutes later. And we wanted to reduce that time. And so we sometimes made a lot of direct integrations into our product and our databases to basically run parallel processing. So there's just a lot of like work on this integration specifically, and it touches upon each of these categories. Other things that are, and this is just inbound, by the way, just left-hand side, inbound type stuff, thinking about the user journey process, mapping out process flows, thinking about how long each step takes. Just because like the time from when you sign up on the website to the time someone reaches out to you, the time to lead is probably one of the most important things for inbound. However way you do it, like Ramp just had a lot of volume. And so we couldn't, like today at Clarify, Austin probably has some sort of like real-time update within the Slack channel. Like when you get to high enough volume, that stuff doesn't work. Like you have to like filter, you have to sort, you have to score, you have to analyze. And then it's as you integrating those things, you're just creating debt. And so you're creating latency, you're creating lag, you're creating things that could fail, and you have to have audibility and reporting and all that stuff. So that was probably like the main thing around inbound. People call it the leaky bucket issue, where if you look at the number of leads that came into the website, the number of leads in HubSpot, the number of leads in Salesforce, the number of leads in Amplitude, they're all slightly different for whatever reason, because there's errors just everywhere. Other things, we talked about this a lot. Yeah, data governance was a big one. Lead scoring was another big one. So that's kind of like inbound. I'd say in terms of outbound capabilities, it was also pretty similar in the sense that we had an automated email team that would use outreach APIs to send automated emails with personalization. And this is before we had AI prompts and whatever to create personalization at scale.
Yeah, before AI was like at least semi-decent.
Yeah, this was like really early. And one of the product managers left and founded a company called Unify. And a lot of this stuff is like we developed these like signal-based intents before signal-based was a thing. And this generated, again, like the email volume was probably a couple 100,000 a month. And so it generated a lot of inbound from that outbound, if you will, because a lot of that stuff was cold. But we also gave sales teams the capability to do their own manual outbounding, right? So like classic B2B enrichment prospecting type tools. We use Zoom in. We used a lot. Like at Ramp, we developed our own waterfall. We developed our own CDP. We didn't use any of these, like we didn't use Clay. That's actually one example that I thought was interesting as I was thinking about this last night. Clay was hard to adopt for us for a long time. It wasn't until I left, I think, that we started really using it because it got really powerful. But we like built our own, and so we had relationships with every single data enrichment you can think of, which is also why our budget was and procurement was really crazy. And I would say that generally, I would not recommend that approach nowadays, because a lot of people ask me how you replicate that formula. And I would say with some of these tools that exist today and AI again, it's so much easier to do this at scale. You don't have to set up your own infrastructure. What else in outbound?
One thing I'll just
here, what is this dated at? What we're seeing here?
This is circa 2022.
Thank you.
2019 to 2020. Yeah. Sorry,
yeah, 2020 to 2022 is probably, this is probably late 2021 is my guess, maybe early 2022.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. 2020 to 20.
The only thing I wanted to add, Justin, is just bringing it back to the framework on focus, on interoperability, on coupling. So the focus piece, if you're looking at this chart, like I think we often failed at Ramp on focus. We had lots of tools doing lots of the same things. We're not very focused in saying, hey, the purpose of this tool is for X. But I would argue that was a function of two things. It was a function of the fact that we had grown rapidly. We'd gone from 50 people to 200 people in like less than a year by the time me and Justin joined. A lot of the operators who were working at Ramp were young, not necessarily, nagging on them. They were a little bit inexperienced, so they didn't really know the consequences of buying a lot of tools. And they were also given insane goals to go drive growth. And so it was very much still a growth at all cost mindset, which meant we often ended up buying a lot of tools that would have overlapping feature sets. That was one of the reasons why Justin and I were brought in. So this is just to normalize the fact that focus often gets worse as your company gets bigger without intervention. So it's something you have to monitor and maintain. It's not necessarily something you have to care about as much as a small company, but as you get bigger, you do have to care about it. On operability, I would say like we had a lot of operability. All these tools could connect to each other. And as Justin kind of pointed out, we kind of didn't do, I would say, what was right, or not we, but like, what happened at Ramp before we came there was lots of tools were connected in ways that didn't always make sense. And if there's one thing I would leave people with, it's like you always face tough choices about how to connect tools. Having a strategy, a philosophy, and a process for how you connect tools is the number one takeaway. It's not to say, hey, don't connect tools in a particular way, but like educate your team on how you connect tools, why, and in what order. That way there's consistency and repeatability. So like a great example, I'm maybe if you remember this, Justin, is like we had a bunch of tools that were talking to both HubSpot and to Salesforce. And it was often the exact same data, which then was creating a bunch of fields on Salesforce.
Clearbit was a clear one. So we
exactly.
had Clearbit hooked up to HubSpot and Salesforce. and our database, which was our CDP. And then we also ran it for other things. And so it was being called on multiple times for the same person, and it was just not focused, right? Like, and it would give you the exact same data back, essentially. So that was one example.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so it's, you know, when Ramp was growing up, they didn't have the time to go fix this problem. But when the contract came back in the first year and it was $600,000, we're like, okay, maybe we should fix this problem. Like, this seems like, you know, a couple weeks of engineering work and is a less than $600,000 problem to fix. So that's a really good example. And somebody asked about the arrows, which I think gets to the point around operability and redundancy. So how you connect data is like one of the most important things here. So if you have a philosophy and approach about how you connect data, the arrows should start to move in a clear direction. It's going to be down the funnel. And that's like maybe one of the key takeaways here, regardless of how you situate or orient your stack. In this particular model of a funnel, the reason why it's a funnel is to really dictate that like you don't actually want to be pushing data up the funnel a lot of times. If you do that, you're going to do it from the reverse ETL at the bottom of your stack from the warehouse. And the reason why I feel pretty strongly about this is like the more you can do to reduce the commingling of data between tools instead of the one directional flow of data tools, the easier it's going to be for you to debug stuff, right? Like, and we'll show you on the next slide, but like one of the biggest problems for this is actually when you have Salesforce and HubSpot talking to one another, because they each are acting as their own hub and spoke models. And so like Justin said, if you have a bunch of tools that connected to each of these and they're exchanging data from one another, when something breaks in any of those tools, now it has propagated to the entire system. So some of this is around like, how do you make it, how do you become flexible? Well, you become flexible by being able to like make changes and understand changes easily. And you can't understand changes easily when you have tight coupling. So you can think of it as like operability is your ability to be coupled. Coupling is the choices you make that actually like enforce that coupling. Sorry, I wanted to jump in there, Justin. Do you want to talk about the bottom of the stack or anything you just want to cover here on Generate?
I think I'll just summarize. So like what we did well here is like MarTech and BizTech and Sales Tech shared similar roadmaps. We like aligned really well. And Austin and I had shared mindset in terms of this FRIC model that we kind of are talking about in terms of evaluating new tools, evaluating existing tools, procurement, right? We started with like 60 plus, we narrowed it down dramatically by like 50% or something by the end of this, right? It took a while. It took probably like 2 years, but still, shared roadmap, shared mindset, alignment. The second thing is that we, you know, really focused on investing in data movement, like Austin said. Like we thought about this really maniacally, and we invested in tools that like would allow us to do these things more easily. You know, whether it's like latency, data volume, direction, like you pointed out, which tools were at our disposal, which tools did not exist, how do you evolve some of these things? Like that was a huge part of both of our jobs. I think the third one was like we always wanted to do, like we created more monitoring, more auditability, because at the end of the day, these things will go wrong. There's always issues happening every single day, and so you have to create a clear process for your team on how to troubleshoot. You have to create clear dashboards and reporting that make it easier for other teams to, you know, help us. You just have to make this stuff auditable and traceable, and that was honestly pretty difficult to do, but it was again part of a shared roadmap. You know, same thing with some of the dedupe rules, merge rules, like that stuff. We had to like work a lot with engineering teams because they didn't quite understand the data that we're working with. We didn't understand the data that we're working with. And then, you know, some things that we didn't do well, like there's a lot. I mean, documentation was lacking. There was a lot of like redundancy still, even by the end of our time. It was highly redundant in some ways. We implemented lead scoring in ways that were kind of broke a lot of stuff. Yeah. Anyways, there was plenty of issues as well. So I can get into it as we go in more detail.
The lead scoring, what platform did you choose to use for that, or did you write your own?
We started with Matt Kudu. And we eventually got rid of it and we built our own.
Completely. Okay.
Yeah.
I would argue, qualification today with AI is going to be 100x more powerful than bespoke custom qualification with fields ever could be. Mad Kudu and a lot of these tools are very linear in the sense that like you gather a bunch of data and then you're effectively writing a math equation that says, based on these field types, route the person or not route the person. Humans are actually really good at qualifying people if they have the time. But the problem is time doesn't scale. That's the reason why almost all qualification processes at startups are like somebody is just looking at the lead and making a decision. And then that you can't scale past that until you put a system in place. So with AI, you actually have the potential here to like build something crazy powerful. Even at Clarify right now, it's like we were talking about, do we just like throw a bunch of data into OpenAI and let it qualify? We built a little mini prompt out of that using Zapier, and it was pretty good. So my strong feeling or prediction is
same
that
thing for me with Perplexity. I just built one using Clay and it wasn't, yeah, it was fine.
you're
It
building
worked.
Clay and Zapier and an iPass tool. There's probably going to be some bespoke custom tools. I mean, I know Default's already doing this inside their system. I bet Unify will do it. We're certainly thinking about it in Clarify. So I would argue the next generation of tools, qualification is going to look a lot less like, hey, go build all these custom rules, and look more like connect your tool, give us your prompt, and you're good to go.
Yeah, I was looking at HighSpot, and they have, I mean, what they're doing is like a black box. No clue what they're doing it on, and it's missing so many components. When you're going through the close, I'm actually curious if that's also part of upsell and renewal sale. If you can just talk about that as well, please.
Well, Justin, I'll just clarify the model and then I'll hand it over to you to talk about the stuff at Ramp. Yeah, close in this case includes renewal, includes re-engagement. All the stuff that happens around closing a contract and collecting revenue is in that close bracket.
Okay.
Again, this is just a framework. You could totally break it up. If you wanted to slice it in half and have initial close versus renewal close, you could do that. The point of the model is to show the flow of data down the funnel. And I encourage everybody to just like make this their own by changing it to match their needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the general things here is that as you implement tools, they need to move downstream, whether it's into the CRM or into the warehouse or both. Depending on which team you talk to, right, the source of truth is different. And so you need to make that data available. I think in terms of close, what I would say here is that these tools, I guess, one, tend to change less often. There's a lot more kind of user-based, kind of experience here. There's a lot less automation sometimes that can be had, but some of the same principles apply in terms of FRIC. Like you need to think about why are you procuring a tool. So we had some redundancy issues here as well, right? Like I mentioned with Outreach and HubSpot. And honestly, at Ramp, like we ran into a lot of deliverability issues and we did a ton of experimentation. And one thing that's like super counterintuitive that I tell people, people are just sending using Gmail. That was like the best deliverability rate they could find. Just because the API was such a black box and we couldn't get a good answer from Google on like why they would ban certain accounts and why not others. But again, like all this was just sort of do experimentation. We didn't really know for sure. We continued to run experiments with new providers and APIs just to see if deliverability was better, open rate was better, things of that nature. But in some sense, you also need high volume to do this. I would say for folks that are like wondering what are the best tools to buy, honestly, like in terms of sales outreach, they're all pretty comparable. They're also robust nowadays that you're going to have a focus problem regardless of what you buy because they're all trying to encroach in each other's space, right? Same with Gong and like these transcript tools as well. I think the important thing is to make sure that the data can be available or at least exportable into a warehouse and can be massaged into something that could be usable for salespeople. And so this could be through like a reverse ETL. This could be like straight into tool. What you want to prevent is like a lot of users swivel chairing between like 5, 6, 7 different applications, because that just makes the experience really difficult. And it's almost easier to start with a simpler model, which is like, hey, this is what you're going to have. This is your base set. If you want to go ahead and like procure your own tools, that can be okay, but in a certain type of controlled environment as well. But this is what you're going to have to work with. Like one example is like we have, again, at Ramp, a ton of enrichment platforms. You could use any single one under the sun that you'd want. We have probably a license for that, but we only try to have people use Zoom Info as much as possible, just to centralize everyone into one area, so that we can create automation for that a lot easier, as opposed to trying to support everyone using Clearbit and LeadIQ and yada yada yada. For everything else, we try to automate as much as possible. Yeah, I think that's, I mean, close to Anne's point, like when we were at Ramp was a free product. We did end up having a SaaS product eventually and multiple products. And so like we built our, like, for example, CPQ was a decision that we had to make, and we just never procured one. My team just built one from scratch on Salesforce, because our product was so basic. And we wanted to remain, again, flexible, like the F part. And so, yeah, a lot of these toolings nowadays, like don't require, us to like procure something completely new. So, yeah, I don't have a ton to say about the reporting piece, other than, again, some of the same things apply. Like the data team is going to have a lot more opinions around what is your best reporting tool. You're always going to be able to report within these applications as well, like Salesforce reporting for salespeople. There's things that Salesforce doesn't do really well that's really well known, right? Like trending analysis, time gap analysis, that type of stuff. And so you just outsource that to something else. We didn't get super fancy, I think in terms of reporting.
Hey, Justin, for the sake of time, I think I'm going to skip forward a little bit, and I will let people know that we have a bunch of slides that go into pretty much everything Justin just talked about. So I'm gonna skip through them real quick, but like all the examples you talked about are on these slides. We probably should have just been moving through this entire time, but we were having a good conversation and there were lots of good questions. So I'm actually going to leave people with these slides, and I think I'm going to jump ahead just given the amount of time we have left, because one of the questions somebody asked was about flexibility across stages. I'd love to talk about this for a little bit, and then hopefully you can interject too with some of what you've seen at Segment, at Ramp, at Airbnb, and now at Perplexity, because you've kind of lived this experience of pre-post growth scale fit. And so I'm gonna do a little bit of lecture, but jump in and interrupt me. And hopefully we'll get to the end of these slides with about 5 to 10 minutes less for additional questions. Does that work for everybody? Cool. So yeah, so there's a lot of good questions, and I want to make sure we get to these. So let's actually address this first one here from who is this? From AJ around basically how do things change over time. So that was like one of the core things we wanted to get to here, which is flexibility of your stack across different company stages. There's a really common model, which is Single Singles framework for stage of company growth. There's pre-product market fit, post-product market fit, growth, and scale. And you can kind of see company growth on the x-axis and the value of the company on the y-axis. And what the chart is basically saying is like, hey, pre-product market fit, everything is really crazy, and that's going to come out in your stack. Post-product market fit, things are kind of stable and growing a little bit. Growth stage is where things are at that inflection point and growing rapidly, and then scale is where that growth has tapered off, and you enter a new phase of stability. We have a bunch of different case studies that we're going to go through. I'm going to try to go through them rapidly, and then there's also what's not on here, which is Justin's experience across these different companies as well. So let's just quickly move through this. Pre-product market fit, like what are the focus areas? What are kind of like the recommendations? The focus area is around generalized system understanding, basic tool management, trying not to boil the whole ocean. At this moment in time, the company's life is kind of not clear yet. Like it's not a sustainable company. And so worrying about things that don't matter is kind of the worst thing you could possibly do. So this might mean you make choices that seem really backwards or like against your natural tendencies, but that's totally okay. Integrate tools with native connections, avoid complex work, do things that are easy. It doesn't matter if it's not scalable, because again, the number one problem these types of companies have are solving product market fit and earning revenue. So like, it doesn't matter how great your stack is if the company dies tomorrow. And this is like an example, obviously, from one of our customers, Volca, where they're using Clarify as their CRM. They have Grain connected. They got Clay. They're doing a bunch of stuff that we talked about they shouldn't be doing. They have arrows going in a bunch of different directions. It's totally fine. It doesn't matter, because guess what? If anything breaks, the founder or somebody else on the team is just going to jump in and fix the problem. There's not enough scale yet to really matter. As Justin talked about, even like, every time we get a lead, it's posted into a Slack channel. We get like, on the order of dozens of leads a day. It's not an overwhelming amount of volume. If you're somebody like Ramp getting 2,000 leads a day, you can't triage from a Slack channel anymore. Then we get to post product market fit. So this is where you're basically taking tools off the shelf and you're starting to think about interoperability and you're starting to think about coupling. I would say still companies have not figured out coupling yet. They maybe are living with some of the consequences of their earlier choices, but they are starting to take a pretty consistent approach to tool management and capability assessment. It's like, hey, we're not going to just integrate any tool off the shelf. It's got to be SOC 2 compliant. It has to work with our tools. We have to understand its purpose. We have to design a contract for it. And a great example of this would be Thena. You can start to see some of the coupling issues here kind of pull out, right? It's like you see a bunch of arrows in different directions. They have a CDP, they have HubSpot, they have a warehouse, they have Clearbit, they have Clay. You'll notice though the theme is that like arrows are connected in lots of directions. There's a bunch of backflow. They're starting to resemble the question of redundancy. So this starts to ask the question around what is the focus of these different tools. And I can give you a little bit of spoiler. We're not going to go too deep into it, but like when the founder of Volca was kind of the revenue guy or the growth guy at Thena. And one of his biggest takeaways to me, if you could go back in time, was they just tried to do a tool for everything. So I think like one of the questions earlier in the Zoom channel was, how do I think about people versus process and tools? Thena bought way too many tools. They bought so many tools and connected them all that it basically required them to go have headcount or to decommission tools. And so kind of what happened is they grew quickly, but their appetite for tooling and process and constraining the stack grew faster than the company could support. And so when this person left the organization, the founder, Mike, had to kind of go and unwind a bunch of stuff, being like, hey, we don't actually need these 7 tools. We just need 5. Maybe it was served a bespoke purpose, but like every single problem doesn't need to be solved with a tool. It might be solved with just ChatGPT, for example. We might be able to get by with Perplexity or some other version of a custom build. Last 2 real quick, we have flexibility across growth and flexibility across scale. I would argue these are just kind of like 2 inverses. Flexibility across growth is all about, how do you actually think about, your architecture vision? How do you plan for the future? This is all the stuff that Justin just talked about. When we entered Ramp, there were a lot of problems that were a consequence of that coupling that built up over time. And so you can see here, like this is a stack that actually came out of DBT. You start to see that actually all those arrows are starting to move into a more clean direction. You're starting to make choices about how data flows in a unitary way. You're starting to eliminate redundancy. You're starting to see focus across the stack. And a lot of this comes naturally because you have the resources, you have the people, you have the appetite organizationally. Again, when you're a pre and post product market fit company, there's not often a designation of having a RevTech or MarTech person. It's like, it's a village doing the job. When you get to the scale, you have a person whose job it is to actually manage this type of stuff. So the reason why you can have a cleaner stack at a growth scale company is because they're investing in it as a practice, as opposed to just a single person whose job it is. And then obviously you get to enterprise, which I would say is kind of like the culmination of all these things, which is where, in some ways, everything is static. There's lots of process, lots of constraints on the organization to changing the stack. But one thing that can happen that I saw at Walmart, I'm curious if you saw this even at Airbnb, is like, people kind of get frustrated by the status quo of how hard it is to change things. So they will try to circumvent the process by building their own tools or their own kind of stacks or versions of stacks that live outside of the status quo. And if you get to a really big organization like Walmart, it's not even that there's a unified stack anymore. It's just like there's so many people that like, how do you actually coordinate amongst 100,000 people? It's really hard to, but that also means it's really easy to find a budgetary owner, go do whatever the hell you want. And that's kind of the lesson of Walmart is like, we had a bunch of different stacks. We had like a mobile growth stack. We had kind of our pure CDP stack. We had a marketing product stack. You have all these different databases with different tools that are kind of not connected to one another. Capital One is dealing with somewhat of the same problem. They have different business units that have their own complete stacks, and they're thinking about, how do I get this into a central repository, how to coordinate across people. And then the question becomes a lot less around, hey, do I try to control people, and more about how do I give people the tools to make their own choices, but how do I control the vendor choices at a really high level? You know, because that becomes a monetary decision, right? If they're managing, I don't know, 100 different tools across different business units, it's this question of, do you centralize that vendor procurement process to maintain ownership of the stack? Or do you just kind of put rules in place to let people offboard on their own? So this was kind of a very quick ending. I want to give a little bit of time here for some of the questions. Real quick to wrap up though, we got CRMs and attribution coming up next. It's going to be with Pranav from Paramark. So if you guys have attribution questions or talking about stuff related to data, that's going to be a great conversation for it. And then still to come, we're going to talk about diagnosing parts of the stack, deciding when to add capabilities, building enrichment and prospecting, and more. So I want to turn it over though and maybe review some of these questions. Chris and Ben, are there any particularly you think we should start with, or should we just open it up to the floor?
Austin, one that got a fair amount of upvotes, but I saw you answering it kind of in a stream of thought there, is whether or not you want to revisit Kaylee's about being in growth mode, balancing tooling usage / needs against investments in people.
Yeah, Justin, I want to get your opinion because I feel like we kind of experienced this a little bit at Ramp. There was a tension at Ramp, at least when I felt like I was there, between do we just go build the thing ourselves with our engineering resources, or do we hire people to help us build the thing? And I would argue when you're a small company and you're under-resourced, it's like, hey, just buy the tool. If you know, Chris, to pick on you because we work together, it's like Chris has a problem and it's like, if we can do this for $5,000 in a tool, let's just go do it, right? We don't have to hire somebody. But as you get bigger, that tool complexity grows, and now you do have to think about, well, do we have the actual people not only to like do the thing we're trying to do, but to manage the tools we buy and stand up as a consequence of that? So there's just this natural push and pull between tools and people that you have to get through. There's not really a right answer. What I was trying to indicate in my dialogue though is like a lot of it comes down to the cultural values of the company. What is the context of the company? Do you have money or do you have people? What is the articulation from the leadership team about what they care about? And ultimately, if you feel like you're in a position where you're not getting love on either end of that stick, they're saying, hey, we don't have money and we don't have people, then I try to turn the conversation into trade-offs. Like, okay, well, at the end of the day, this is how many people we have. This is our roadmap. And these are the trade-offs we're going to make. You know, so like now I'm putting it back in your hand as a leader to say, like, what are the things we should work on given the resources we have? And if you feel like that's not good enough, like we're not achieving the goals based on the resources, then let's talk about the levers that are available to us, like people or money. I think a lot of rev tech folks in particular get stuck in this like unfortunate situation where like they're asked to do more than they can and they don't know how to break out of it. And one of the best ways to break out of it is, again, to turn the conversation to trade-offs. Like there's only so much we can do. This is how engineers think about the world, is like there's a million product requests, but there's only so much time in a sprint. So what is most important to the organization? What are the problems to solve? Because guess what? There's always going to be more problems tomorrow. If you're always like fixating on the next set of problems and not focusing on strategically on what is important to the business, then you're gonna get lost. And Justin, anything you want to add to that?
A couple of things. I mean, in today's world, you're probably not going to get much of a higher approval even less so than what we previously faced. I mean, if you do have one, you're probably in a select few of people that do. But for the most part, I'm sure most companies are asking themselves, how do we do this without people? How do we do this with AI? And so I think when it comes to picking good tools, also because there's way more nowadays than there used to be, you have to think about like what it like one quote that one of the leaders at Ramp like used to tell me, it was like, is this for a core critical use case at the company that we can't build, that we have to build ourselves, or we can't, or is this for something else? Like lead scoring, again, example, is never a core use case. Like everyone needs to do it, but you really don't need to build your own unless you have some incredibly specific reason where you have to pull data that like no one else can give you. And so whereas like a ramp, like, oh, we have to do fraud detection, we're not going to outsource something so critical to a vendor, even if they're really good at it, right? And so you have to think about it in that way. I think in terms of RevOps or like operations people, tools that give you flexibility, like for example, Clay is really great at this because you can kind of just procure a very small subset and try it out and actually see if it works. And same with like a lot of these AI products. If there's something like, hey, I'm going to try this out for 3 months, and here's my hypothesis of why I think this is going to help with some metrics. And after 3 months, we can decide. That's an easier proposal than buying something much larger than that. And so even if not using Clay as an example, because Clay has great self-service, but if an AI doesn't have that self-service capability or pricing, ask them for it and be like, listen, I only have budget for this much, or I want to do a trial and see, and we can go from there. And I want to be very specific about what I want to accomplish in that trial. And if we can have metrics to back that up, that's just going to be an easier proposal for procuring a tool than, hey, we need 10 licenses, yada, yada, for what, you kind of slice and dice the use case a lot more to kind of like a very small trial period. So
Any other questions you want to end on? We're probably going to run over with one last one, but there's a burning question from anybody before we drop. Cool.
got really great participation though, so this is pretty fun.
Yeah. Real quick, just like thumbs up, thumbs down. Did this session feel better and more helpful with the questions and the conversation? Yeah. Seeing some thumbs, some confused faces. So I'm going to take that as mostly yes. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. We're going to hop here. We're at the hour-and-a-half mark. Justin, thank you so much for coming in. Just a reminder, guys, we will have follow-ups with the slide deck, the recording, Justin's information. If you're one of those companies that can hire people, maybe you can hire him. And we will see you all next Monday for the next session. And just Justin, thank you so much for coming on. It was awesome to have you.
Yeah, thanks guys. Appreciate the participation and great meeting everyone. Nice to see some faces there, and yeah, appreciate it, Austin. Let me know if you have questions, but just seems like a great course overall. So happy to be part of it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your week. See you next.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye everyone.